getting them around. There's more going on here than what's exactly happening. And so in Exodus 18, verse 21, this is Jethro, and he's telling Moses, he's setting up kind of the rulers and the helpers of Moses. And as he's setting them up, he's telling Moses, he tells him to appoint rulers over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And then he sets them down on this kind of this hillside. It's a very similar scene in Exodus chapter 18, verse 21. Well, Jesus is doing the same thing. You set them up, and this is what we're looking at it's almost the new Israel scene. This is the new Israel. This is the new order of God's people. So he sets them up, and what does it say that he does? So whenever you read down, it says in verse number 41, there are 4 verbs that he does specifically that take place here. It says he took, blessed, brake, and gave. Now, if you did not know what we were reading about in Mark chapter 6, what does that sound a lot like him doing? It does, doesn't it? In fact, if you want to jot this down next to Mark chapter 6 and verse number 41, this is the same exact thing that he does in Mark 14, verse 22. Same exact thing, where you see him going and taking and doing the same thing at the Lord's Supper. So he took bread, blessed, brake, and gave. And so it's a preview of what's about to happen over here in Mark chapter 14. The very same verbs given, almost the same setting. And it says that he did this. And by the way, when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, he then goes and does all these things, blessed, brake, and gave the disciples. It says 2 fishes divided he among them all. The question for you and I is, how small were the pieces that he cut up those fishes? Were they? No, he didn't take them and divide them as far as cutting them up and everybody getting a single gram of fish. No, what they did was take them, and it kept going and going and going. And it says this to the point that they all did eat. And what does it say they were? Full. It says they're full. And so that's not them eating and just having enough sustenance to get by. They are eating and full. And so they're stuffed. That's not just a tasting. It's not a sampling there. That's a full meal that they're given. And so he fully satisfies him. After that's over, it says in verse number 43, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments and of the fishes. Now, a question for you. Why do you think there are 12 baskets left over? 12 disciples. What did the disciples say a minute ago? Send them off, right? We don't have enough. We don't have all this money that you're going to need to go out and buy all of this. And so you have 1 full basket of leftovers, and who's that enough, or how many is that to carry for each of the apostles? They get 1 apiece, don't they? I mean, every one of them, they get their own basket kind of filled up and symbolic in a way, but every one of them. And so each disciple who said, send them away, they've got a whole basket of leftovers now. And so the lesson within a lesson. And so the answer to their unbelief, what does he give them so they can see? Everybody is fed. Everybody is full. And you think them carrying those leftovers, that probably preached as loud a lesson as anything, didn't it? I mean, looking at what is left. And so the question for you and I is, what does Jesus not have power over? Is there anything to this point he has come across that he's not been able to overcome? No, nothing. Authority over everything. And now, to this point, he's even able to do this for the apostles to have extra so that they could see the lesson made again. And so, as he is going and doing this, 12 baskets, we have 12 tribes, we have 12 apostles. Israel's now being fed by the true bread from heaven, isn't it? And so, as we get to this, there's so many different lessons we can take of this. And from the apostles' perspective, from the people's perspective, Matthew chapter 14, verse 21 is the sister text, by the way, where it says about 5,000 men. Matthew 14:21 adds, besides women and children. And so you have there maybe 12 to 15,000 people in this. Fed them all 5 loaves and 2 fishes, all fed from a boy's lunch. Any other thoughts through verse number 44? Okay, so continue reading. We're going to transition just a little bit. It says in verse 45, and we have a new scene unfolding. So this is right after this has happened. It says in verses 45 down through verse 48, "And straightway he constrained his disciples to get into the ship and to go to the other side before unto Bethsaida, while he sent away the people. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. And when even was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the fourth watch of the night he cometh unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them." Now stop at the end of verse 48. So you have a new scene that takes place, and they're here on the sea. So let's think about what he does and takes them. So verse number 45, he straightway constrained them. Constrain them is the way the King James puts. That's like he is compelling them. He's sending them off. He's saying, you go on the ship and you go. He's giving them what to do. And John 6:15, if you want to jot this down next to verse 45, tells us why he is sending them away. Mark doesn't tell us specifically. John tells us in chapter 6, verse 15, it says the crowd was about to take him by force and make him king. And so he is sending off the apostles at this point. He is protecting his men from a coronation the crowd is about to force, because that's their reaction to this point. And so he is sending them off. And while he sends the apostles off, what does Jesus by himself go and do? Departs the mountain to pray. When does he usually do this? We've seen him do this to this point, but it's at pivotal moments, isn't it? He takes the time to go up to the mountain to pray alone. We've seen that in chapter 1, verse 35. We see it here in verse 46. We'll see it again in chapter 14, verse 32. Now, in chapter 14, the first chapter, we have a very busy day at the ministry. At this section, we have here the night after he multiplied bread. Well, in Mark 14, verse 32, the time that you and I really know that he goes and he prays in the garden, what is he going and praying in the garden for in Mark 14? It's the night before the cross. And he's praying there in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he goes and he prays where nobody is watching. Now he is up, and so let's think about this for a second. Where are the apostles at in verse number 47? As you're reading verse 47, they're on the sea, aren't they? Where is Jesus at? He's up on the mountain. And so verse 47 happens, and what does he do that may not be exactly what you and I would think would be natural? He walks on water. Before that, what does it say that he does? Verse number 48. The first part of that, what does it say? He sees them. Well, where's he at? He's up on a mountain. Does it say he brought with him binoculars? He's not looking at them in terms of that. They're out there toiling on the sea. I don't know how far away it was, but probably a pretty good ways. And there's another layer to this that you and I even add to this. They're toiling out there and rowing, and you can think of the nightmare it would be to try to get anywhere in this day and age. They're not firing up the Mercury and able to just power to the other side. They're rowing. They're having to fight against the wind. And I want us to notice something here. He saw them toiling and rowing. And so he's on a mountain. And by the way, what time is it? Fourth watch of the night. So that's super early in the morning. You're probably 3 o'clock in the morning. It's dark. He's up on the mountain. It says he sees them. There's an insight to this where this is a lesson. Are we ever rowing in the dark unseen? Is there ever anything that God does not see? And I wanted you to look at the word. It says toiling. The King James says toiling and rowing. That word there is the same word used last chapter in chapter 5, verse 7 with the demoniac, where it says they're tormented and they're tortured. And so it says these men are being tortured and tormented by the wind. They're being tormented to the point where they are fighting and fighting and fighting in order to be able to overcome this wind. And as they are doing these things, Jesus is there and watching. And as Gary mentioned, the time of night, this is going to be, it says, between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning, the fourth watch of the night. So they've been rowing in the wind. If they left out the day before, they've been battling it 8-9 hours. This is not like they've gotten out there. And so he is now seeing this. And there's something I want you to look at as you read what happens. It says in verse number 48, the end of this says, He comes unto them, walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. Now, I want to show you something really neat. If you want to jot down this, jot it down next to verse 48. Job chapter 9 and verse number 8. Job chapter 9, verse number 8. Mark is quoting Job and fulfilling what Job said, because Job over there in Job 9:8 talks about walking upon the sea. It says, "Who alone spreadeth out the heavens and treadeth upon the waves of the sea?" Well, in Job's account, who are they talking about? Who alone can do that? Jesus. At Job's time, though, who are they talking about? Who's Job talking about there? God, right? Only God can do that. And so what is Mark pointing to us here? Who is Jesus? Jesus is God. Who alone can do that? That's Job chapter 9 and verse number 8. He wants you to see who this man is. This is not just any ordinary man. Who exactly is this? Now, there's another thing that takes place, and I don't want you to pass it by. The very end of verse 48 says, would have passed by them. Now, you and I read this, and you and I take it as he's going to walk right by him. That's not what he's saying here. If you go back and you read the Old Testament, what he's saying here is he's pointing back to a way that God would manifest himself in the Old Testament. Here's what I mean by that. Go back to Exodus chapter 33 and verse number 2, or 22 rather. Go back there with me. Exodus chapter 33 and verse number 22. And I want you to see here that this is another layer that Mark adds on for us and tells us exactly what is happening and taking place. So Exodus chapter 33, go down to verse number 22, and it's talking about here Moses in the cleft of the rock. And look at what happens. Exodus chapter 33, verse 22, "And it shall come to pass while my glory passeth by, that I will put thee in the cleft of the rock, and will cover thee with my hand while I pass by." Now, who is it talking about there in verse 22? He's talking about God again, isn't it? And he's talking about the way that he is going to appear, way he is going to manifest himself to Moses. He is going to go and he's going to pass by this place. Go to 1 Kings chapter 19, because it's not the only time we see this in the Old Testament. 1 Kings chapter 19. When you get over there, look about verse number 11. So this is Elijah, and he's up on Horeb. And it says in verse 11, 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11, "And he said, Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake." What does it say at the beginning of that verse in verse 11 that the Lord did? You see there? He passed by, didn't he? And so, as we take those things into consideration, now go back to Mark chapter 6. So as you read Mark chapter 6, it's not saying to us that he is just going to go and he's literally going and passing them by and he's not paying them any attention. He's going to walk right by him. No, it says whenever he's doing this, what does it say that he's going to be? How is he going to manifest himself? In the same way that God did. In the same way that God did back to Moses, in the same way that God did back to Elijah. He's going to go and he is going to pass by. He's saying that he is going to be in the same way that God appeared in the Old Testament. He's going to go and pass by them. And so the question is in our mind. And remember, Mark, the entire Gospel of Mark is dealing with the question of who is this man, isn't it? Who is this man? And what is the answer we are arriving at as we read this? Who is this man? Is he a prophet? Is he an earthly king? Is he God? And we have seen over and over again the answer and the pointing out of the answer. And I want you to think back to all of the things we've seen to this point. Because it's not like Mark has just given us one thing that Jesus has had power of. In this chapter, what does he have power of? Power over. You think about the sustenance there. Now we have the weather. He's walking on water. I mean, we read that almost flippantly and in passing and realize, okay, what is he doing there? He is walking upon the sea. Next time you're at the pool, try it, right? I mean, it's something that we can't even fathom. We can't even imagine the picture of what it would be to have the ability to command the water to be able to walk on it. And that's what he's doing. It's another day. Because for him, he owns everything. He made everything. He's the creator. And so, what would you do if you were the apostles? Well, Read verse 49. So verse 49 comes out, and it says down through verse 52, let's just read this section. But when they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out. And they all saw him and were troubled. And immediately he talked with them and saith unto them, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. Stopping at the end of verse number 52. Okay, so he is walking up to them. They finally see him, and what do they think it is? What's the first thing they think it is? A ghost. They think it's a ghost. It says a spirit coming up to us, and they don't know what to think. This is 12 grown men. By the way, are they novice fishermen? No, you got professional fishermen on board who spend probably more time at sea at some point in their life than they have on land, probably a lot of time, if not maybe just as much. And they're seeing this, and they're scared to death. Well, if it's 3 a.m, and you've been battling a rough sea all night, and all of a sudden you see something walking out toward you, the next time that happens to you, what would you think? So we look at them, and we give them the reaction. And there's two sides of this, because the one side is, well, look at all they've seen. The other side is the human side that you and I would react to this, and they're beside themselves on what they've seen. And so as they see him in verse number 49, what does it say they did? They cried out. They're afraid. They yell. They're afraid of what's going to happen here. And so the answer Jesus gives in verse number 50 says, For they all saw him and were troubled. It bothered them. It bothered them that they saw this. And Jesus gives them the message. He says, immediately talked with them. Now, by the way, in verse number 50, where is Jesus at? He's still on the water, isn't he? He's not yet come aboard. None of that. He's still on the water. And by the way, from what we learned in verse 51, is the water already calm? No, wind is still blowing. The wind is still there that they have been battling and now have been going through the entire night, tormented as a result of it. And he talks with them and says, Be of good cheer. It is I. Be not afraid. Now, another layer to this, put it up on the screen for us to consider. Whenever he says the word, whenever he says, It is I, who does he mean? Is that more than just I being Jesus? Whenever God is there and he's in the burning bush in Exodus 3 and 14, who does God say that he is to Moses? I am. That's right. The I am. Who does Jesus say that he is? It is I. It is I. It is God, and I am here. And it's not merely saying it's don't worry, it's Jesus. No, it is I. It is the I am, and that I am there. And so this disclosure, 3 a.m, they have the disclosure again. And I say 3 a.m. From 3 to 6 a.m. would have been the fourth watch. And so early in the morning, they have this disclosure. And it says in verse 41, He goes to them in the ship, and the wind ceased. The moment he stepped in, the wind stopped. Could he have stopped it at any time? Sure. At any time, he could have done it. He could have stopped it at any time. He steps in. His presence in the boat is enough. It stops. It ceases. And now, as a result of that, it says in verse number 41 into 42, what is the apostles' reaction to everything now that they have just witnessed? They're amazed. The first word there it says they are sore amazed. It means that they are literally beside themselves at what they have just seen. So the first reaction is they are sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and then what does it say? And they wondered. And Mark's way is describing this. They've never been more rattled in their life. Okay, this is a terrifying, amazing incident that they have just seen and has unfolded in front of their eyes. And they, at this point, they don't know what to think. They don't know what to do. But at the end, in verse 52, now just stop there for a second. In the end, in verse 52, what does it say? It says, For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. And if you realize there, that kind of ends this section in a way. And there's a few verses that are left tacked on to Mark chapter 6 that will actually more apply to chapter 7. But as you see and you kind of bookend that sentence ought to bother us, shouldn't it? I mean, it bothers me because you think about, and what you and I would say was, look at all they've seen to this point. They've been with him the whole time. You've seen demons now. You've seen the loaves and fishes. He has raised someone from the dead to this point, healed all manner of diseases. He's done all of these things. But even then, it says the end, verse 52, what was their problem? And that's the apostles. So if the apostles' heart can be hardened, can ours be? It absolutely can be. And so if you think about what that means, whenever Jesus said in Mark 3 and verse 5, the word, and talking about there that hardened heart, Mark 3 verse 5 says that the hearts were hardened of who? Somebody look at Mark 3 and 5 and tell us, who is he talking about there? Mark chapter 3 verse 5. And here's a connection there that's scary for us to make. Because here he's talking about his apostles. Mark 3:5, who's he talking to? He's talking about the enemies of him. He's talking about the Pharisees. Yeah, he's talking about the Pharisees. And now he's saying that same hardened heart is now creeping into his apostles. It's now creeping into them. And so you think about the familiarity that they have at this point of all the things that they have seen. They're more amazed at this point by the miracles and the things that they are seeing than they are at who Christ is. And I think to this point, here's what I think. Let me give you this, and y'all tell me if you think that this may be the key. At this point, I think they may be amazed by the miracles. Do you think at this point they really, really understand who Jesus is, though? Doesn't seem like it's clicking all the way yet, is it? To me, it does not seem like they're fully understanding. And I think there's a reason he keeps reinforcing to them and using that Old Testament language. And who are they thinking about as he's saying those things? They're thinking about God. I don't know if it's clicked for them just yet of the statements and what he is doing and performing, that they're not there with another great prophet. They're not there with just the Savior, not taking that away. They're there with God. They're there with the Creator of all. They're there literally with him. And so what a warning for you and I as you read verse number 53. You can watch him feed the thousands and yet still cry out in fear and be afraid at this point when there's a storm taking place. And so the problem, and here's the thing. At this point, if you and I were arguing this case, has there been a shortage of evidence for the apostles to see at this point, to not fully know who he is? Has there been enough evidence? I mean, how much more can we give? And we're not even done yet. There's not been a shortage of evidence. So then what is the problem? Shortage of belief. And that nails it. That's exactly what it is. The problem is a heart. And if you have a heart that's hardened, what does that mean? I mean, what is that heart doing? It's not opened up, is it? And that belief is exactly there, the problem that we see taking and we see happening. So as you read through this, understand that this is something that is not just something that'll happen to just the apostles. Can it happen to you and I today? Absolutely. Is there any shortage of evidence today for who Christ is and who God is? No. So then what is the problem? It's the same problem as then. The problem is our hearts and what we're going to choose to do with our faith. And so Mark chapter 6, and here's kind of the wrap up of Mark chapter 6. Now let's go ahead and just read. Let's read to the end of the chapter. And there's a few things there we'll talk about as we wrap up. It says in verse 53 and following, and when they had passed over, they came unto the land of Gennesaret and drew to the shore. And when they were come out of the ship, straightway they knew him, and ran through that whole region round about, and began to carry about in beds those that were sick, where they heard he was. And whithersoever he entered into villages or cities or country, they laid the sick in the streets and besought him that they might touch, if it were but the border of his garment. And as many as touched him were made whole, through the end of the chapter. Okay, so just stop there. So think about the answers and the four warnings out of Mark chapter 6 that we have and were given. I think one of those is absolutely familiarity is not faith. They know who the man Jesus is. But are they fully convinced of who Jesus truly is? Not quite yet. There's still a hardness of heart that they possess. And so the other thing that we saw at the beginning, familiarity, there is a problem with that, because when we walked into Nazareth, he walked out and he was still the carpenter that they knew. He wasn't the Savior. You go over the second warning, the price of the ministry. We read in verses 13 through 30, who lost their life because he simply preached the message of repentance. John lost his head simply because he chose to stand up and tell someone the truth. Third, we see the fear of man is a snare. Herod fell into the trap of killing John. Why? He was afraid of the people. He was afraid of what they may think if he made this oath and did not follow through. And finally, consider the loaves. When the wind is contrary, the toiling and rowing in the fourth of the night, remember those 12 baskets. And so Mark chapter 5 tells us he has authority over the demoniac, over disease, and over death. Now in Mark chapter 6, what do we see take place? Now he has given this power to the ordinary men. He has walked on water to catch his people when the sending gets hard. And now he has proven that his message is not just constrained to him. Now that gospel message he's presenting and giving out himself is beginning to spread. And as you read the end of Mark chapter 6, that's exactly what's happening and taking place. All right, any other thoughts through the end of this chapter? Kirby? Yeah. Right. Right, and you're there. And the thing about it is, I think I was reading, and I believe it was over there in John's account when I was studying. I believe the trip they were taking was like a 2-hour trip. Like, it shouldn't have been a long trip, and they'd been out there 8 or 9 hours fighting it. And then, as Kirby says, you take over the sister account of this, all of a sudden Jesus gets there, and they're where they need to go. Absolutely. And so it's almost amazing to me that you get to the end of that, and that hardness of hearts. You know, really, it's a question of the heart is all this really is, isn't it? I mean, how much more can they see? Do they need to see? Well, same question for you and I today. How much more do we need to see? All the evidence is there. It's what we choose to do.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but also at this time, were other people proclaiming to be the Messiah as well? And wasn't there also like the ability, did they have some kind of abilities to perform, I don't know, perform miracles, perform something like that? So that maybe that's why they were questioning?
Could be, and we'll get to that because John's disciples especially are going to be the ones that we kind of will talk about here in a little bit. So keep that in your head because that's something we'll come across. Yeah. All right, appreciate y'all. We'll stop here and take a quick break and begin with our worship service. But appreciate your time and comments. Make sure if you get a chance this week, read Mark chapter 7 and look at the reaction there of the Pharisees in that chapter. Mark chapter 7 next week. Thank you all.